This week, I'll show you how to get that blurry background effect. By this, I mean a shallow depth of field. So when you focus on your subject, the background is all blurry and out of focus. When DSLRs first started doing video, this was all the rage. In movies, when you see a close-up shot, it's normally using this effect. And in photography, it's been around for years. You've just got to know how to set up your camera to get this working for you. If you've got a camera and the know-how, you can do this with pretty much any camera. If you follow along with these tips, you can even get this effect with your iPhone. It'll be subtle and it'll be a lot less than with a full frame camera or a medium format camera, but you can still get it. There are basically 4 things that you need to think about and change to get this effect working for you. These are aperture, focal length, the distance between you, your subject, and the background, and sensor size. And if you combine all of these together, you can really exacerbate this effect. Now, I'm not going to go into the science behind this because I'd be here for hours. I'm just going to show you what you have to do to get this working for you with your camera. If you have a lens with a really low f number or a really wide aperture, you can get this effect quite easily. A budget lens you can get for this is the nifty 50 from Canon. This is the 50mm 1.8, and I think it comes in at around about 60 to 80 pounds. However, if you are shooting with a crop sensor, the framing on a 50mm can seem quite tight. If you only have a kit lens with an f-stop of say 4.5 to 5.6, it'll be a little harder for you to get the background out of focus just using this alone. But keep watching because there are ways to get around this. So let's look at aperture. This is at f16, this is at f8, this is at f4, and this is at f2. You can see the background now is out of focus compared to what it was at f16. So with your camera, you have a lot of versatility to make the background blurry or clear. Now let's have a look at focal length. With a zoom lens, if you zoom right in, you can isolate your subject. Whatever the longest lens you have is, put that on your camera, or if you have a bridge camera, zoom right in. You may have to walk backwards a little bit to get the right framing, but when you do, focus on the subject and you'll notice the background will go out of focus. If you only have a wide angle lens at f4 or above, you'll struggle with this. This is shot at 25mm on a full frame camera. It's quite a wide shot and there's a lot of the background in the shot. So now I've changed to 50mm. You can see the background is a little bit more blurry. Now at 85mm with the same framing, the background is a lot more blurry than 25. The next step is to look at the distance between the camera, your subject, and your background. If your subject is really far away, you'll struggle to isolate them from the background. The further away they are from the infinity point on your lens, and the closer they are to you, the more you'll get the background out of focus. Once they get too close, you'll start losing them outside the frame. But with a little repositioning, you can get this effect working for you. If you can't get close to your subject, and your subject is close to the background, you'll find it almost impossible to get this effect. At the moment, I'm equidistant between the camera and the background. I'm basically in the middle. But as you move your camera further away from the background, and you move your subject further away from the background as well, the background will become more blurry again. So with an 85mm at f2, I'm about 7 feet away from the camera, and I'm about 7 feet away from the background. I've now doubled the distance between the subject and the background. So I've moved both the camera and myself further away from the background. So I'm still about 7 feet away from the camera, but the background is around about 14 feet away from me. Now I'm even further. I have the camera right against the window. I'm about 21 feet away from the background. Now you can see the background's really blurry. The sensor size doesn't directly affect how much blurriness you can get. However, it changes the focal length that you need to get a certain framing. or the distance you need to be from the subject. Basically, if you shoot with a crop sensor and take a photo, if you put exactly the same focal length on a full frame camera or a medium format camera, you'd have to get a lot closer to get exactly the same frame on the subject. This in turn makes it easier to get that background out of focus. I'm shooting this on a full frame camera with the 85mm at f2. And you can see the background is nice and blurry. Now I'm recording on the RX10 Mark III, which is a 1-inch sensor. This is a lot smaller than a full frame sensor, and you can see the difference in the background. The sensor size isn't affecting the difference in the blur. With a smaller sensor, you need a wider focal length to get the same framing. On the full frame sensor, I was shooting with an 85mm lens. With this, to get the same framing, I'm shooting at around about 20 to 22. Because the focal range is shorter, the background is less blurry. But just remember, if you're on a smaller sensor, to get the background blurred, it's a little bit more tricky. You just have to rely on the first 3 points, which is to get the aperture as wide as possible, to get the longest focal distance for the framing that you want, and to work out your distances. So a big distance between your subject and the background, and a smaller distance between the camera and your subject. So you can see, with a smaller sensor, it's a little bit tricky, but if you know all of these points, you can work them to your advantage. So to get the blurry background, get your camera into aperture priority. Zoom in on your subject. Drop the aperture number as low as possible. Make sure your subject is close to you and there is a good distance between the subject and the background. Focus on your subject. Take a photo. But remember, there are so many different aspects about photography. So you've got to think about composition, framing, light, and so many other things. This is just one aspect of photography. If you only have a camera with a small sensor, it'll be a little bit more tricky, but if you focus on those first 3 points, you can still get this effect. So drop the aperture number as low as possible, zoom in on your subject, and get as close to them as you can with the framing that you want. It's really important that you bring your subject away from the background, as far as possible really. The more distance that you create between your subject and the background, the more that background will fall out of focus. This photo has been taken on the iPhone, and this photo has been taken on the RX100 Mark II, which is a 1-inch sensor. The effect isn't as strong as with a full frame camera, but you can still get the effect and isolate your subject. And that's about it. If you have a camera with interchangeable lenses and you really like this effect, consider buying a 35mm or a 50mm lens with a really low f-stop, as low as you can afford. As the f-stop gets lower, the aperture gets wider. Therefore, the manufacturers have to make the lenses bigger to cope with this wider aperture. More materials mean more of an expense to them. Therefore, these lenses will cost more. So say if you bought an f1.2 50mm, it'd be really expensive. There are some really good budget lenses out there. As I mentioned earlier, the Nifty 50 from Canon is great. This was my first lens with a really wide aperture. It's a 50mm 1.8. And even though the lens is quite plasticky, it takes really nice photos. The other brands make equivalents to the Nifty 50, so have a look around. You basically want a prime lens with a low f number. Another option is to try a vintage lens. I have an FD 50mm 1.4. It's not the sharpest lens in the world, but it does give some really unique photos. I think I bought this for between 60 and 80 pounds. I have an adapter for it, so I can fit it onto the camera system that I use. If you have a bridge camera, get your aperture as low as it'll go, zoom in on the subject, reframe your subject, and get them as far away from the background as possible. So whatever camera you have, you can get this effect. It may be a bit more subtle, or it may be quite extreme. Just tweak and tune the settings and you'll get the look that you want. As always, if you like what you see, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, give me a thumbs down. And for weekly tutorials, hints and tips in photography, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you in the next one.